Good afternoon. It is 3:35, Wednesday, February 5th. This is the TDN Writers Room podcast. My name is Joe Bianca. I am the associate editor of the Thoroughbred Daily News.
I'm Bill Finley. I'm a correspondent for the Thoroughbred Daily News, and my world is gloomy without Mookie Betts. Man, that sunk.
Jonathan Green, DJ Stable General Manager, and I'm happy to report that the Mets are not part of the discussion today.
Alan Carasso, managing editor of the TDN. I have a stack of papers in front of me right here that I plan on tearing up at the end of the podcast.
I'm getting ready to clutch my pearls about it. Don't worry. The Green Group Guest of the Week is sponsored by the Green Group, an accounting, tax consulting, and advisory firm specializing in the thoroughbred industry. With more than 500 clients in the horse business, they were bred to save you money. For more information on how they can help you, visit www.greenco.com. So our Green Group Guest of the Week this week is the Executive Director of the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation. Welcome, Pat Cummings, to the show.
Thanks, Joe.
So it's timely to have Pat on this week. The TIF had a white paper recently about racing and how it can become more self-sufficient. And then yesterday it broke that the Pennsylvania governor was looking to raid the state subsidies that go to thoroughbred purses for a myriad of reasons. So my question is, this is called decoupling, taking the state subsidies away from the purses. This is probably coming to other tracks and other jurisdictions. My question to you, Pat, is how can tracks better prepare to basically live life on their own and be funded on their own handle, basically?
It's a vital question, Joe, and one that I think, when you tie it all together, you tie in the paper that we just released that we called American Racing Sustainable Future, and the situations that have kind of been bubbling for the last, I'd say really probably 4 or 5 years, but it's all the culmination of kind of essentially 2 decades roughly of neglect. And then you study the incentive structure that exists in the sport. I think it really comes down to who is going to be most responsible for the future of racing. And that, to me, the answer is really the owners and the breeders. This is not a problem for racetracks to solve. And I think what has been pretty notable is that the only people that we've heard from so far in roughly the 28 hours or so since the news broke out of Pennsylvania are the horsemen's groups. We haven't heard from Parks Penn National or Presque Isle. We haven't heard from Penn National Gaming. We haven't heard from Churchill Downs Incorporated. And this really kind of, I think, goes to the heart of the situation that exists in American racing right now, is that racetrack owners are not incentivized to grow racing. They're incentivized to maintain their casino properties. They're incentivized to keep that, what I'll call more easy money coming through, as opposed to the hard money, which is coming from racing. The expensive money that is coming from racing. It costs a lot to maintain racing, far more than it costs to maintain slot machines. And I think a lot of these corporate interests, and very clearly, Joe, we can't blame them for this position, and we shouldn't. And that just getting angry about it and passing blame to them is a bad idea. It is wasted energy. These are public companies most of the time. They are doing what they think needs to be best done in the interest of their shareholders. And if you look particularly at the price of Churchill Downs stock over the years, by gosh, they've done a heck of a job. They have looked out for their shareholders, and they've done it well. That is their number one interest, to grow and increase value for their shareholders. The burden for this falls on the people who care the most, and it's the horsemen. It is their livelihoods. It's the people who have invested millions and millions in blood stock, in training bills, in looking after their horses and buying horses. And they are the ones who really need to take the ball here and run with it. And this Pennsylvania situation is really kind of full circle. I am a 2002 graduate of Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I grew up in Pennsylvania. It's my home state. I now live in Kentucky, but I wrote my senior thesis in 2002 on the efficacy of slot machines at Pennsylvania racetracks. I was a political science undergrad, and that is what I focused my time on there, and why the state would be benefited from doing this. And what has happened in the interim is the state and the horsemen have basically not invested back in the industry. They've allowed it to flounder. When you combine that, essentially that widespread negligence, to invest in the industry, to do anything more than basically pay out purses, to basically do the bare bones minimum of investing in the facilities themselves, which has often been just required by law, by the actual gaming law in the state. When you do those sorts of things and you're not investing for the future, you're not trying to read the tea leaves, you're just taking the money, you're left in positions such as this. Now, there are many questions as to whether the governor of Pennsylvania is actually able to do what he says he's planning on doing. And there will be a wicked fight ahead in the next probably 4 to 5 months. So let's not count this one over the line on behalf of certainly the needy and the deserving underprivileged students in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This is an issue for owners and breeders. This is not an issue for the racetracks. The owners and breeders need to take far greater control of the sport and the future of it. And they are the ones that have the incentive to grow it. And if they don't act in a far firmer fashion than they have over not just the last 2 decades, but really the last 40 years, then it will hasten the demise of racing in many places.
Pat, it's Bill Finley, and thanks for joining us. And the way we would like to see this problem solved is pretty obvious. Increase handle. Now, the statistics have shown that handle has gone down dramatically over the last 16, 17 years. But if we could instead get it to go in the right direction, get it to go from about 11 billion now to, let's pick a number, 20 billion or something like that, then we wouldn't be having these problems. We wouldn't have to rely on slot machines to keep racing going. But that's obviously easier said than done. How does this sport get to a point where we see positive impact in improving numbers each year in handle versus what we have been seeing, which by and large is handle goes down most every year and over a sustained period of time has gone down dramatically?
The first point, Bill, is try something. Get out of this funk, this multi-decade funk that the industry has been in, and try something. And horsemen need to demand it of racetracks because the racetracks oftentimes are the ones that are in there setting the takeout rates and defending the takeout rates. And the topics that the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation has put forward over the last 18 months have all been kind of more smaller topics, individual topics of things that need to be done to make betting on racing more attractive. So, for example, the issue of pricing, takeout rates, breakage, make horse racing more competitive. Marshall Graham, who is one of our board members and has certainly gained plenty of press in the last few months on various topics, and a shrewd economist, said it very clearly in a piece that we ran, and I know that was in the TDN a few weeks ago, where he said very clearly, racing is the third worst gambit, the third worst option in terms of pricing. It is only bettered by Keno and the lottery. When you have those as the only kind of quote unquote worst options, or the more expensive options, it's not looking good. When you've got the rest of the gambling sphere is basically modernizing, presenting modern options, presenting dynamic pricing, reaching consumers with plenty of information at low price points or no price points for that matter. Competition is fierce and rife. We do not have that situation right now in horse racing, and we've allowed kind of the status quo to fester in the sport. We can't do that. But it's going to take tracks to try things, and they're going to have to get horsemen to demand it of them to get to that point. Now, I actually think that this Pennsylvania situation is potentially a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call to other states, and it's a wake-up call to certainly Pennsylvania horsemen. They have given out over $2 billion in purses earned from slot machines in 13 years. That's a heck of a lot of money that's gone out of the system. They need to do without a little bit of that, and they need to invest in the future of the sport. They need to make it more competitive, and there are some decisions that are happening in some other places. New Jersey and Maryland this week have made news on this front of trying to present a better future for the sport than what has been the present. And these are things, you have to have a competitive wagering product, but until somebody wants to put one out there, tracks have not been incentivized to do that. Let's be very honest about this. The reason that takeout remains high, breakage is still usurious, racing betting information is still expensive is because tracks haven't had to rely on handle to drive their business. They've been essentially taking money from a slot infused subsidy in different forms, in different states, and at different amounts, unquestionably. But the sport hasn't had to sustain itself. It hasn't had to rely on betting. And as a result, our betting menus, our technology, the information that is provided to players is terrible. It's rife with mistakes. It's expensive. We've been withholding millions and millions and millions of dollars in loose change that otherwise should be going back to players and infused back into the system, all because of some 1920s laws that were in place to allow states to hold that loose change back. It's ridiculous. It's legalized larceny, the withholding of breakage. The market's changed. Racing hasn't changed with it. We need the opportunity to make those changes. We have the opportunity to make those changes, and we need to start going forward. If anything, this should be a wake-up call, not just for Pennsylvania, but across the country.
Pat, that was great. Thank you very much. It's Jonathan Green from DJ Stable, and I read through the report, all 7 pages with great interest. Thankfully, we've been asked to be a part of a couple of the boards of some of these groups that are trying to reorganize racing and try to make it better for not only the end users, for the fans, but also for everyone involved. The thing that constantly comes up in as a question for us as owners, is which organization do you follow? Is it the TOBA? Is it the NTRA? Is it the Jockey Club? Is it the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation? In other words, there are so many different groups out there that sound like they're calling for the same changes and same ideas, yet they're so scattered across the industry, geographically as well as philosophically, that we don't know as owners which one to fall in line with and support. That's what constantly kept coming up in my mind is, it's a great idea to have the 3 different organizations, one that would handle the integrity and safety, one that would handle marketing and sponsorship, and a third one that would handle wagering and technology and some of the issues that you were just alluding to. Yep. But ultimately, my question is, who ultimately has the power and the leverage to follow through with these ideas so that way owners and end users like DJ Stable, for example, or other stables here, in the United States can kind of fall in line and follow because it's just way too confusing right now.
Yeah. The answer to this point, John, is that none of them have done it. And our faults are entirely collective. There is no one finger to point in the direction of any one organization or entity. Everyone has essentially failed us on this. What it's going to take is some real dynamic leadership and a couple people in the industry who will stand up and say enough is enough, that our future is looking far bleaker than where we are today. And if you think today's not all that great, well, then imagine what that future is going to look like. Our first recommendation in the paper, American Racing Sustainable Future, is essentially blow it up. Demand a reorganization of the industry's self-created groups. There are undoubtedly some good ideas, some good programs, some decent things that have been done up and down the industry. I think most notably within the last decade, the focus on developing meaningful aftercare solutions and legitimate kind of second careers for thoroughbreds has been a shining example of what can be done if we put our minds to it. And I know we're not fully there on it. But the thing I think to consider is that as much focus as we have wanted to put on that, and the thought that we need to do more of that as an industry, and that we will need these sorts of things to defend our fiercest critics, is to look at the greyhound industry. Because greyhound adoption rates are and have been for the any recent past roughly 90%. If you were looking for a raft of stories, mainstream stories about how greyhounds had been mistreated, or welfare issues, or dogs dying on the track, or poor care, or poor aftercare stories, or a lack of organization on that, you didn't miss them. They don't exist. So greyhound racing is dying in America, and yet they have retired roughly 90% and rehomed 90% of greyhounds for a long time. So the path to success and the path to a better future is not simply just kind of clearing up our house and getting those things in order. It's laudable that we have done what we've done as an industry. We have to do more, but it is definitely not the only path. We need to have a real owner breeder driven focus on starting over, on pressing the reset button on how our sport is organized. And there's been plenty of talk about the federal bill, the Horse Racing Integrity Act. You guys have talked about it. It's been written about ad nauseum, and it will probably continue to be for quite a number of months. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with it, right? It's a laudable idea. Okay. People don't know where to stand, as you said, John. Do we stand for it or against it? What are really some of the benefits? How about this one? How's it going to be paid for? How about another one? If it gets passed, if this were to go to the Senate, if it were to be signed into law by the president, what is the timeline on several states' attorneys general suing the federal government for overreach and saying that they are taking away the state's ability to mandate this, which is otherwise something that they would believe is something that is given to them? I think it's a very likely outcome. Okay. We could spend a lot of time talking about those things, a lot of time talking about whip usage. But at the end of the day, our fundamental business is struggling mightily. And all of these organizations have kind of really put themselves into corners on certain topics. On the federal bill, on use of the whip. Meanwhile, Rome burns, and it has for a long time. And you look at the numbers just out of Pennsylvania that we published on Tuesday. The amount of purses earned from racing handle in Pennsylvania, this is combined breeds, thoroughbred and standardbred, has dropped by 70% over a 13-year period of time. So our reliance and our focus, we've become addicted to the revenue from alternate gaming. We've ignored our own housekeeping, essentially, and we're putting out a product that people are abandoning. Handle is down 50% adjusted for inflation over 15 years, and the same organizations and the same people are talking about the same things. So at some point, and maybe it's folks like you, Jonathan, maybe it's other owners, people that are on the board of TIF are certainly starting to talk about it more and more, about demanding a reorganization and starting something brand new. And if it means unseating some of the organizations that exist out there, no harm intended, but we need to do something different because what you have done has not worked.
Hey, Pat, Alan Carasso. How are you, sir?
Hello, Alan.
Hello, Pat. One thing you touched upon, you brought up the Monmouth situation. Obviously, you've been a proponent of fixed odds wagering versus the paired mutual system. Just talk for a minute on how you see that impacting and driving handle.
Well, the complaints from horse players on a variety of things have just been very notable over the years. Bill there has been an active complainer, rightly so, Bill, on the late odds changes and things of that nature, and the debilitating effect that can have on players, particularly those that don't have access to computer wagering systems. How it's just bad for customers. We have not evolved our competitive marketplace. The technology in our tote system remains antiquated. The way in which we present information to players is poor and essentially unchanged. The announcement from New Jersey that's going to come probably, with this racing season to manage fixed odds for horse racing in Jersey is fantastic. I don't anticipate this in any way is going to replace tote betting in this country, but fixed odds betting is meant to complement the existing offerings that are out there for wagering. Now, in the early days of this in Australia, 20 years ago or so, they did, I think, $46 million in the first year, and they did $4 billion roughly 20 years later. The exponential growth has been substantial on fixed odds. I don't think we're going to necessarily see it jump like that in America. But when all of the growth, all of the attention, all of the marketing has been on fixed odds sports betting, for racing to not have a complementary product that presents customers with information in a similar fashion, and customers will know what they're going to get at that point of return. I don't know how you can think that people who were up there betting over 53.5 on the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl are going to tolerate betting a horse at 7-1 and getting 7-2. That's a very quick experience to say, this stinks. Why are you not giving me an alternative to this? I really give a lot of credit to New Jersey. They've been at the forefront of this, particularly Monmouth, obviously, and to do this deal that they have done with the bet makers out of Australia. I think we're going to hear more and more about this in the coming months, but it can only be a good thing to present racing in a far more modern fashion to a wider range of customers than we are at this moment.
Pat, it's Joe again. One thing I wanted to touch on, and I think one of the reasons that I think people should listen to you when it comes to fan engagement, better engagement, and all that, is because you do have experience working for the Hong Kong Jockey Club in the public affairs division. I think there are two main differences between Hong Kong that are really important that we should mention off the top. One is a more centralized governing body, the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And the second one, I think, which I've advocated for, and I think other people have advocated for, is less racing, more consolidation. Beyond those two things, let's say that we don't more mirror Hong Kong in those two ways in the near future. What are some small ways that racetracks and the racing industry can better present the product to its bettors?
The first one, and the one that has stuck out for me the most, Joe, and is one that you have seen in the work reflected from the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation over the last year and a half, has been the focus on transparency, information transparency to customers. And this is really all about just presenting a sport in an open and transparent fashion that meets the needs and the questions of customers and the concerns of customers in a way that they're coming to expect, not just from racing in places like Hong Kong or Australia, but really in all sports. The fact that our sport has gone as long as it has without stewards being held to a standard to basically publicize their decisions, their rationale, to question jockeys, to question trainers, to put that on the record, to get it out there at the end of every race day. When that is a standard practice in just about every other jurisdiction on the planet, is disgraceful. And I've been trying to identify, why is it that way? And I think the answer is pretty much that Americans don't really spend a lot of time in comparative study of other horse racing jurisdictions. They've tended to just focus on themselves. And that applies to many people who are regulating the sport in this country and many existing stewards. Again, so I don't blame them for this consistent failure. It's just it's the way life has been. But as part of my role in Hong Kong, I sat in the stewards room at the end of every race day and took note of the penalties that were coming down and the reprimands and the suspensions and the way in which they had to deal with all the jockeys and the licensed personnel, because that information was then going to get reported to the media. And in my particular role, I was a liaison between the club and the media, and I would kind of prompt them to understand what was coming forward from the stewards so that they knew it. And that they could get prepared for it and understand it. And they would come and there would be essentially an impromptu press conference at the end of every race day. Some days there'd be 3 or 4 media there. Other days there'd be 10 or 15, depending on what happened in the particular day. And if you are running a professional sport in America, not to mention a professional sport where the foundation is betting, why would you not want to present as transparent and open a process and procedure as you could to your betting customers? And that was the biggest thing I saw, that they were way out in front on this one. And we are seeing it now from baseball and football and basketball and hockey, that officials and the way in which they have communicated either directly with the public, directly with those that are watching the sport, or after the fact, the way in which the NBA now publishes the last 2-minute reports for certain games, were the calls right, were they wrong, and there's an assessment. This is a dramatic change over the way in which we consume sport even 10, 15 years ago. They're evolving, they're changing. What's racing doing? We still don't have a logical explanation from the Kentucky Derby, which is remarkable, but frankly to be expected. That to me is the one thing that we can do. It's very doable, and I do need to commend the Jockey Club for putting some funding behind a program that will send American stewards, basically an exchange program, to send American stewards overseas to embed for multiple weeks to see the way in which this is done elsewhere. And I think that will be the start of a process, but we need to get commissions on board and racetracks. And it's something that we're working on behind the scenes to try and make happen.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up on that in terms of transparency. I know the Hong Kong Jockey Club and other jurisdictions will post vet reports online in terms of in the interest of giving the bettor more of a complete picture of a horse. We brought that up last week on the podcast, and there was some debate about that would maybe kill the claiming game in America. What is your response to that? Do you say too bad? Do you think there's a middle ground? What do you say?
Well, putting aside for a second that I think we should kill the claiming game in America for a variety of reasons, and that's a whole nother podcast, I suppose. But there is a duty for the sport to present some information about the health of the participants, particularly if wagering is involved. And you know this. Other sports have done this for years. Forget racing. The injury reports that sports have put out. It's something that we have seen done and evolve, and always with some degrees of controversy, right? In Hong Kong, Hong Kong often is held up as the example for publishing vet reports. All they're publishing is whatever is considered extraordinary. They're not publishing the daily feed regimen or watering or the supplement that a horse was given or an ordinary treatment for a rash that the horse may have had. They publish only what is considered extraordinary veterinary treatment. So if a horse has been off for 7 months, there's often a reason that you can go into the vet reports and figure out and see what that is. Or if the horse had a surgery to remove a knee chip or had a tie-back operation, that is the sort of thing that gets reported. Now, the structure that is required to get that sort of information, I do see some significant challenges to applying that in America. So let me offer an alternative. What could be done is regulatory veterinary reporting in the immediate aftermath of a race that gets published to Equibase alongside the post-race chart, such as a horse that was shown to have bled, a horse that was reported to have been lame by the regulatory vet after a race, or maybe the presence of mucus in a post-race scope in a cool-out barn. Those sorts of things could easily be applied without a real tremendous investment. And I think it would be a nice step forward to start seeing that. This is all about respecting our customer and presenting them with a sport and a wagering opportunity in a modern landscape that is far more evolved in other sports than what we see today. And we need to be competing in that space. And the thing is, other jurisdictions on a racing platform are doing it, and North America is really falling behind.
Pat, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier and bring the casino operators back into the equation and the discussion. Obviously, it's not good for so many American racetracks to be owned by casino companies who, you said, have no incentive to promote racing. I think it goes even further. I think they have an incentive for horse racing to die, so that they don't have to go through all the trouble of putting on the show, paying the purses, etc. I imagine when this news came out in Pennsylvania yesterday, they were popping champagne corks and high-fiving each other in the offices of Penn National and places like that. So you have racetracks in an industry controlled by companies that want to see the sport die. And I don't think that's hyperbole to say that. I mean, they're not going to admit it. But at the end of the day, they would rather not have to run horse racing in any of these places. What can the sport do about that?
I agree with the point wholeheartedly, Bill, and you took it to the next level, and I think that's entirely appropriate. It's frankly, it's just kind of pure economic logic, and it's sad, but it's true. And in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Mexico, Indiana, every track is owned by some sort of corporate gaming interest that has assets that go beyond whatever they're doing for racing. And I think you could go even a step beyond that and say it would be crazy for us to think that these sorts of interests aren't trying to stoke the anti-racing sentiment that exists in other corners, because it would be in their financial interest to shed racing and shed the requirements to continue to operate racing in order to maintain their casino licenses. So I think those are all fantastic points. Now, what are the alternatives? How do we as an industry survive in that environment? I think that really relates to the second recommendation that we made in our white paper, which is that horsemen, be it owners, breeders, trainers, need to look into the feasibility and prepare the financials for either buying or leasing the racing rights from racing facilities. And where would one, kind of look to do that? We offered an example of Canterbury Park in Minnesota, which has flown under the radar for a long time. It is hardly the sport's kind of shining example of horse racing success, but they've done incredibly well, quite quietly, for a very long time. In 1992, Canterbury shut down. It had been owned by Ladbrokes, the British bookmakers, interestingly. In 94, it was bought by a couple businessmen in Minnesota, and they quickly realized that if we're going to keep this as horse racing, we need the investment of the local horseman population. They went public. They issued stock. They bought it for $7 million. A year later, they raised $8 million, mostly from horsemen, to buy stock of the Canterbury Park Holding Corporation. In that $8 million in 1995, up until today, the market cap is now $57 million. It's traded on the NASDAQ. It is essentially a micro cap stock that a lot of people in racing don't really know about. 22 of their last 23 years, they have grown revenue. In the wintertime and the off time, Canterbury leases, rents space in the stable area for Minnesotans to house their boats in the wintertime. Okay. It is a very creative effort. Now, they have done a deal with the local the local tribe, the local Sioux tribe that is there in Minnesota, and they have done a deal which basically says we will not pursue a separate gaming license, but we will have this partnership, and we will pay you some money to cross-promote and facilitate business. It was a good deal. It was a $70 million deal that they did, and that has helped sustain their business. And that is actually up for renewal within the next couple of years, so I'm sure it will kind of come to the fore again. But here's a place that has continued racing, has done fairly well, is publicly traded, and it got to that point because horsemen invested in it. Now, the ownership is concentrated over the years. Horsemen have sold out of their stock. A lot of it is concentrated in the hands of the original owners, who I think insiders control roughly 42% of the stock the last time I had looked, back in December or so. And, there's plenty of mutual funds that own shares of Canterbury Park. They're presenting a model, they're presenting an opportunity and a way to approach how we can run maybe a more holistic business. Racing in this sort of world is going to look a lot different than racing looks today, where horsemen are basically takers. They've taken the money that has been given to them and subsidized. They need to be givers, not just of money, but of time and of innovation and of a willingness to evolve the business. And I think there is an opportunity. Some places may do it better than others. And I have to think that Pennsylvania horsemen are going to start looking at this thing in a slightly different way to maybe get their act together and do things a little bit differently as time goes by. But horsemen buying and leasing rights from tracks, I think that's a direction that is really going to need to be considered, and horsemen are going to need to get out their wallets.
All right, Pat, that's all we got for you. Can't thank you enough for the time, and for everybody out there that's listening. If you haven't checked out the TIF or their work so far, I highly suggest you do. I think what you guys do dovetails kind of what we're trying to do every week, which is talk about these macro issues in a real productive way. So we appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thanks so much, Joe. Really appreciate it. And I can't say I catch it every week, but I catch it a lot of weeks. So I really do appreciate the ongoing discussion.
We'll take that for now. All right. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, guys.
All right. The Green Group Guest of the Week is sponsored by the Green Group, an accounting, tax consulting, and advisory firm specializing in the thoroughbred industry. As the Green Group Guest of the Week, Pat Cummings will receive a free 1-hour tax consultation. The Green Group, bred to save you money. For more information on how they can help you, visit www.greenco.com. Today's news/week in review is sponsored by West Point Thoroughbreds. Owning a racehorse with West Point Thoroughbreds can be one of the most exciting experiences of your life. Partnerships offer the thrills and gratification of the sport of kings at a fraction of the investment required to purchase and maintain an entire horse on your own. Experience for yourself why West Point Thoroughbreds is the gold standard in racing partnerships. Visit our website, westpointtb.com. This week's news, we're going to kind of follow up on what we talked to Pat Cummings about, because I think there is so much to say, and Pat takes up a lot of air. So we're gonna get back into it here. But no, we appreciate all his insights. So there's a lot I have to say about this. The main thing is it's a surprise that this didn't happen sooner, honestly, at a major racetrack in America. And then my question is, basically, like, I think it's been 17 years or so, 15, 17 years or so since Pennsylvania started getting slot subsidies for their purses. What is better about Pennsylvania racing since then? Like, that's my main thing, is that racing eventually has to be a self-sufficient business, because these owners that also have casino interests, often competing casino interests, are eventually going to be like, hey, it's way cheaper just to put a slot machine in a room than it is to run an entire racetrack. What are we getting out of this deal? And so my question, I guess, is to you guys, what is Pennsylvania racing doing better now that it has all these subsidies for their purses that they weren't doing before? What have they improved upon?
Well, the obvious answer, Joe, is purses. The purses are astronomical there. But you're right, that gave everybody there a false sense of security, and complacency came in. And you can blame everybody involved with it, from the horsemen to the racing commission, and especially the owners of Parks Racing, who, their interest obviously is how much money they can make in the casino, and horse racing is probably to them something that they just as soon do without. So the purses went up, they went up dramatically, and everybody got fat and happy. And what happened in Pennsylvania, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I'm surprised we haven't had 5 Pennsylvanias up to this point, and we're going to have more Pennsylvanias after this. I'm going to tell you right now how this story is going to end up. The governor is asking for $204 million. The Pennsylvania racing interests are saying, wait a minute, we had this trust fund. You weren't supposed to touch it. We're going to see you in court, pal. You can't take that money. They're going to meet somewhere in the middle, and they're going to wind up taking about $100 million out of the purses. So that'll allow Pennsylvania racing to keep going, whereas under the $204 million, they might as well just shut all their doors tomorrow. But the question is, so now that $50,000 purse at Parks is going to be $36,000 or so under my scenario, will people be so motivated now to do the right things and do a lot of things that Pat Cummings just talked about? Or will they just say, $36,000 for that race is still good money. What do we care? Everything's fine. And that, I think, is going to be the real story here. What are we talking about a year from now in this podcast when we review the great train robbery raiding of the purse fund by the Pennsylvania governor? What's the answer going to be? That's what I really want to know. What are we talking about a year from now?
And I know we talked about this off air, and Bill, I'm in total agreement with you that it's a shock. It's $200 million. The governor is coming in and making huge announcements and proclamations with the hope that he's going to be able to claw back some portion of the trust fund. And interestingly enough, in doing the research on this topic, I actually stumbled upon an article that was written almost exactly a year ago today. It's actually March 12th, written by our own Bill Finley. And in it talks about how the trust fund is going to, continue to help purses and help the breeding program in Pennsylvania and all the correct points. And there was an interesting line in here that I read, and I tried to do some more research on it, just couldn't find any actually salient details, which says, while the state can still take money out of the trust, if it does so, the penalties are so significant that there's virtually no way politicians would be inclined to take back any of the money. And that was a common theme, not only, I'm not picking on you, not only in your article, but also in all the reporting, was that, the penalties are so onerous that there's no way the state or the governor is going to come back and try to claw back any of this money. until it does. And now we're at a point where, the governor is saying he's going to take money out of the fund. And of course, he's going to give it to orphans and the uneducated and the tired, the poor and the hungry, because they need it a lot more than the horses. I'm not being facetious. That's all quality stuff. In reality, we all know that even though politicians always say we're going to give it to the orphans and to their families, it always goes somewhere else. So it's not necessarily, is it to educate the general populace of Pennsylvania versus feeding horses. Okay, it's not that argument. It won't be that argument. That being said, as a racing operator, we've enjoyed the purse structure increase at parks because even though the purses have gone up, the competition is not. The competition is still relatively the same. So we've benefited by having horses, training there year round and winning a maiden special weight race and some of the allowance races and so on. That's what I love. What I loathe is to have subsidies in racing or subsidies in any business. If a business is strong enough to succeed, then they should succeed. If they're not, then the government, and I'm getting on a soapbox, but the government shouldn't be able to come in here and prop it up through alternative funding. The industry already gets tremendous tax incentives to be a breeder or to be an owner of a racehorse. And to me, to have the additional subsidies isn't really the right decision to make. Again, I'm enjoying the purses there, and I'm telling you that it's not necessarily the right thing in my mind. So who's gonna not benefit from this? Well, it's the breeders and the people who race in Pennsylvania. It's the Walnut Greens of the world and the Smart Angles and the Brushwood Stables and the Chapmans of the world. And I feel for them because they are in Pennsylvania for numerous reasons. But I don't think that they're coming and breeding Pennsylvania breds per se for the 20 state bred stake races at $100,000 a piece that they're being offered, or for the additional 20% incentivization bonus that they're getting in Pennsylvania. So I can see where my bottom line is, Bill. I circle back to, I think you're 100% correct. It's not going to be $200 million. It's going to get swept out from racing channels, but it's going to be somewhere more than $1 and somewhere less than $200 million.
2 points on that. Just to follow up on what you were saying about the purses going up and competition being the same. The governor had a quote where he was basically like, these funds should not be bankrolling rich horse owners. And it's a little bit of an oversimplification because there are thousands of lower level jobs that keep the lights on for people in racing. But it really isn't. He's basically right, because these are going to purses that are then paid out to owners, and then this should be stuff that's funded within the industry by bettors, because then you can say it's more of a distributed effect in terms of this money. Right now, it's basically going to Jonathan Green right now, and I don't know about you. I maybe might need a nicer watch, but I think you're doing okay. But no, that's
that Rolls Royce you pulled up here in the office.
Really.
Damn, John.
The Rolls Royce and the Casio watch.
Don't let Governor Wolf know about that. Then you guys are sunk.
Okay, just because I'm wiping my nose with a $100 bill doesn't mean that you guys can pick on me.
Yeah, we should film that. But no, yeah. So it's something that it's my point's done. That was my main point.
Your point was to pick on me. Was that your point? Okay, all right, I get it, Joe. All right,
hey, you had one.
That's fair.
Maybe you had two coming in. This is going to be stupid. I preface my comments with that, but this, like, the governor's going to cut. He's going to find $204 million to fund higher education and give in-state scholarships to people attending Pennsylvania schools. It sounds like a decision Kevin Kline might have made in the movie Dave a few years ago when Frank Langella told him to find $200 million in the budget, and he did. It seems like it's an obvious solution, quick and easy for the guy. I wonder what the likelihood is of passage. And I don't know the first thing about Pennsylvania politics, but the governor is Democrat. Both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania are Republican controlled. I don't know if that means anything whatsoever, but you kind of just cross your fingers for Pennsylvania horse racing.
But Alan, let me jump in here. Think how easy this is for him to sell. Do you want to give the money to John Green so he can buy a second Rolls Royce? Or do you want to give it to poor little Johnny, who's working 3 jobs, his mother is on welfare, but he dreams of going to college? What politician in his right mind is going to come out and say, no, that's a bad idea. We can't do that. So it is going to happen. I don't think they're going to take $204 million, but they're going to take a lot of money. And what you guys have saying, and Joe, again, I agree with you. We want to have a sport that doesn't need this, but it does. what would be the state of Pennsylvania racing if it got no money from slot machines? There might be one track in the state running, a bunch of $3,000 claimers, and maybe not even anything. It might be totally out of business. So how did racing get into this mess? It did, but how does it get out of it? And there's no easy answers. The other thing, too, that we have to keep an eye on is there going to be a domino effect from this? And I'm like you. I've been thinking for 10 years that this money's going to leave racing because it just doesn't make any sense. Wealthy horse owners, John Green, Rolls-Royce versus whatever, taking care of little Johnny who wants to go to college, property taxes, increasing the salaries for teachers. How has racing been able to survive all this time and not get the money taken away? What is going to be the domino effect from this? And that is what is really scary to horse racing, no matter what happens in Pennsylvania or how much money they take away. Is this the beginning of one state after another saying, we want that money for something else. We want little Johnny who lives in Iowa to go to a good college instead of, paying horsemen at Prairie Meadows type of thing. So, that's what we really have to keep an eye on.
I thought Harris Auerbach had an interesting reply to you yesterday when you tweeted this story. And to the effect of, you can fill in the blanks, that even though California racing is dysfunctional in many ways, its funding comes from within. At least on that level, it's on a much sounder footing than say, Pennsylvania.
It's an interesting point. The thing about it to me is what I was saying before about how nothing really, obviously the purses have increased, but nothing else has really improved about Pennsylvania racing. The takeout hasn't dropped. As far as I know, they don't have a drastically better safety record. To me, slots was a lifesaver to racing. It was a lifesaver thrown to the sport. And the point of a lifesaver is not to just sit there and bob in the water for another 20 years. The point is to eventually get back to shore. And I don't think that's what happened with racing. I think that a lot of people got complacent and rested on the idea that this money was always going to be there to prop up an unprofitable sport. And that's, to me, that's the main issue, is that I'm glad we're having all these discussions now, and I think it is worth having a discussion about whether this is a domino effect. But these are discussions that should have been happening 10, 15 years ago when the sport was first starting to see the temporary benefits of slot money. And the second thing is, in terms of the amount, I was stunned that he went for almost the entire purse fund. And I wonder if that is affected at all by the negative PR position that racing is in right now, that he knows that racing overall is not popular. And if they're going to take money from any kind of fund in the state, why not take it from one that's been in the news for the past year with horses dropping dead? Even though it wasn't in Pennsylvania, I think that a lot of people are going to leverage this kind of thing and try to, go after racing more than they would maybe in the past when it had a better, had more popularity, had a better public image.
Joe, I totally agree. And one thing I would say, and again, it's too late now, but one thing I advocated, when you have these numbers that come out that 88% of the purse money comes from slots, that almost means that the handle at parks is completely irrelevant. Mm-hmm. If they handle $100,000 a day or $1.8 million a day, it doesn't make any difference. I would have liked to seen the horsemen at parks, and now that it's too late, maybe horsemen at other slot tracks say, wait a minute, why don't we do an experiment here and make the takeout 7%? And at the end of the day, what difference does it make? Our purses are going to be fine because we have the slot money. Let's see what happens. And of course, best of my knowledge, no horseman's group or horseman ever advocated something like this. You're right. We had all this free money to play with. We had the chance to market the living daylights out of the sport. We had the chance to, experiment with takeouts. We had the chance to do so many things with this money. And basically everybody just got greedy and fat and said, I want it in my pocket. And they didn't consider, or if they did consider, they didn't take seriously the long-term ramifications of exactly what we are talking about right now. And it's very scary. It's absolutely very scary, not just for Pennsylvania, but for the entire sport.
I'm still in fetal position. I have no additional comments for this group.
You didn't deny that you just bought a second Rolls Royce, though. I didn't hear any denials.
I cannot
from that.
confirm or deny.
Okay.
Yes. Dennis racing taught me well.
Yeah.
He crashed the first one when he was joyriding down the Jersey Shore.
Wow, you guys are tough. I mean, listen, the opportunity to give money to the Greens versus give money to orphans, or give money to the Greens versus give money to anybody. I know where I'm coming in that 2-horse race, okay? But I think we're all in agreement that they need to continue to make inroads and not have this slot money be the be all and end all. It's got to be self-sustaining. It just that should be the common theme, is that all of these businesses have to be self-sustaining.
And I think the unfortunate reality is that a lot of tracks are going to have to close. You think Parks is the only track that, is operating because it has a casino behind it? That's not. There's plenty of tracks like that all across the country, and other governors are going to come for that money, for those subsidies.
Joe, but is that necessarily a bad thing?
No,
and
right.
I know
Exactly.
people listening to this might say, God damn, that Finley guy wants to put us out of business. Your favorite track, Mountaineer Park, they're going to close down tomorrow. But what this industry does need is a serious contraction in the number of racetracks and the number of races that are being run. And that's, again, one of the reasons why it's in the predicament it's in. There's too much racing. There's too much crap racing. There's too many 5-horse fields. And, Hong Kong model's not realistic, but I really genuinely think the sport would be a lot healthier if there were about 10 racetracks instead of 50 or whatever there are now.
Totally in agreement. And I bang that drum every week. And I know it's easy for me to say because I'm not, I'm not a backstretch worker that relies on the money that he gets working at Mountaineer Park. So it's obviously easy for me in this studio to say that, but it's just the reality. It's the reality that racing has to stop acting like it's the 1940s and 1950s or even 20 years ago when handle was at 20 billion or whatever it was. It's the reality that you can't keep operating as if racing is still a popular sport in America. It's a niche sport, and you have to start governing it like it's a niche sport that could be gone at any time. So you have to get as efficient as possible, and there just has been so little of that in racing. And I agree that the inevitability is that more racetracks are going to close, and things are probably going to have to get worse before they get better in racing. So now we'll turn our attention to a little bit of actual on the racetrack news from the past weekend. We had a pretty good, I think, trio of preps as we start to get under the Kentucky Derby Trail in earnest. I'll give my thoughts on who I thought was most impressive down to least impressive, and then you guys can comment on any or all. I think pretty obviously the most impressive horse was Tiz the Law, and I thought it was funny that he kind of had similar trip to Mucho Gusto a week before in the Pegasus, whereas he broke on top and then Manny Franco reined him back so he didn't get burned up on the lead, and he got kind of that inside-out trip. I thought it was really interesting, too. On the backstretch, you could see him drag the horse back a little bit so he could get to the outside. I think a lot of stuff in racing kind of is just reaction to circumstance, but occasionally you can see the plan in the jockey's head manifest itself, and I think that was one of those cases because of what happened in the Kentucky Jockey Club that he said, I'm not getting stuck inside anymore. And once he got to the outside, he really quickened. I want shout out to Ete Indian, too, who I think could be really nice. Horse that's bred up and down for turf, but has turned out to be a pretty nice dirt horse. So I think Tiz the Law, I would like to see him wear blinkers because I think even once he struck the lead, he was still looking around and being a little bit green, and he's done that, I think, in every single one of his starts. For all I know, they could have maybe put blinkers on him in a workout before, and it was a disaster, but he's a horse I would like to see add blinkers, but, horses that are successful, you don't see them make equipment changes. After that, I would go Max Player, which I thought was a really good effort, sneaky good, actually, because I thought it was kind of a weird ride by Dylan Davis, honestly. I don't know. I wasn't paying that close attention to Aqueduct on the weekend. Maybe the rail was bad, but I thought it was weird that he sent the horse outside on the first turn. Then he had to go wide again on the second turn. That was more of a necessity. And he really finished. I thought he really leveled off well in that final furlong, and it suggested a horse that will have no problem with the 1.25 mile distance. And even though it was an 87 buyer, I think it was a lot better than it looks just on paper. And then 1,000 Words, I know people are crazy about him. He was number one in T.D. Thornton's Derby 12 this week. I haven't seen anything really that's blown me away. He had the dream trip in this race and really ground down a short length win in a 4-horse blanket photo. I think if it wasn't Bob Baffert and the horse didn't cost $1 million, I don't think he would be as highly regarded as he is now. Could be totally wrong. He could turn out to be a Triple Crown winner. But of the three, I thought his was the least impressive.
That's pretty tough on 1,000 Words, but I understand where you're coming from, Joe. I guess the question with him is, is he just that type of horse? We do get horses that are just grinders. They're never going to beat anybody by 6-7 lengths. I'm not saying he definitely falls into that category, but he might. And maybe someone knows the answer to this, but of the three-year-old races run over the weekend, didn't he get the best buyer number of the three?
No, Tiz the Law got 100.
Okay.
100, yeah.
And I think 1,000 Words got a 91.
Oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right. So never mind on
92.
that. But it'll be interesting to see going forward. I'm sort of mixed about him. And was really impressed with the Barkley Tag horse, Tis the Law. After really liking him after the Champagne, then I sort of, backed off him a little bit when he was third in the Kentucky Jockey Club. But boy, you can put a line through that race now. I mean, he's the real deal, and long way to go. But I think if they loaded up for the Kentucky Derby tomorrow, he's the horse to beat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, holy bull, holy crap! I mean, that was a really impressive win for Tis the Law, Hunter Beyer and a 5- on the rag sheets. I mean, that was really, really impressive. And the hierarchy of the races thereafter can be argued about. One of the things that I wanted to bring up though was the Martha Washington and Taraz. I mean, she really, I know it was a 4-horse field, and you can make excuses as to who else was really in there, but man, did she look impressive! And just as a horse fan watching it on video, she looks like she's like 17 hands. I mean, she's a
huge.
monster.
Huge.
She's a monster,
Yep.
huge horse. And I know they're going to run her in one of the Philly prep races coming up. But I wouldn't be surprised. There's rumors and chatter that she may actually pivot and go into the Kentucky Derby and try to be a Rachel Alexander type horse, or Songbird down the road. But it wouldn't shock me. And again, taking nothing away from her because it was a small field, she looked really, really impressive. So again, I would say that those two horses in that order, Tis the Law and Taraz, were my two wows for the weekend.
Yeah, I agree. Taraz was nominated to the Triple Crown. That came out today. So that remains a possibility if Brad Cox pulls that trigger. If Juddmont's willing to do that, remains to be seen. I thought Tis the Law was best of the weekend as well. I thought there were some interesting performances in defeat. People were down on Shotsky. He was making his first start since the Remsen. I'm not here to call him a Derby winner, but he had every right to need a 9-furlong race, and really was outfinished. The Max Player did have a trip that was much wider. He was 41 feet more than Shotsky. But Portos did good in there as well, coming from way back. And Monday Morning Quarterback had an interesting trip as well. Covered some ground.
And now, just to interrupt you, Monday Morning Quarterback, I think, ran an outstanding race in defeat. Broke flat-footed, and then had to go between horses most of the race, which isn't, for a young horse especially, isn't necessarily what you want to do. And then with, I think, halfway down the stretch, actually put his head in front. And same thing, 9 furlongs probably too far at this stage of the game, because I know that trainer doesn't necessarily crank his horses up for races. But that was a really impressive defeat. Especially, with the course that he had to take.
Yeah, looked like he just ran out of fitness in the last 16th of a mile or so. I thought maybe the best effort in defeat the entire weekend was Royal Act behind 1,000 Words. He was 3 and 4 wide the trip there. And like Joe said, 1,000 Words enjoyed every favor in that running, just in behind. And boy, I thought Pratt was... it was a very ballsy move from Pratt to go through between the High Velocity and Tis a Magician there at the top of the lane. But Royal Act was trapped out, and he kept on, and was still kind of gaining inches at the wire. So honestly, he'd almost be the one I want on that race.
At 20-1, no less. I mean, he was definitely the longest shot on the board, or second longest shot on the board. Nobody really expected him to do anything.
One horse I wanted to bring up from the Gulfstream undercard that I think could be interesting going forward is Mischievous Alex, who is trained by a friend of John Green and by extension friend of the show, John Service. He was really interesting because he had run in the Parks Futurity before that. He had been a little bit disappointing through like 4 starts and then added blinkers in the Parks Futurity and blew him away by almost 10 lengths. And you hardly ever see this. I was looking at the race, and I included this in my preview. Every single horse behind him that day that had run subsequently improved their buyer figure by double digits, which was amazing. I mean, those are kind of things I look for as a handicapper to see like the legitimacy of a figure, and not sometimes it works the other way as well. But he certainly backed it up. He was breaking from the rail in the swale, and that was a deep swale. You had the return of Greenlight Go. You had Untitled, the impressive debut winner, got a 98 buyer on debut. And you had Chivalry, who had won 3 stakes races in a row. So there were some nice horses in there, and he broke well at the rail, punched through under Rad Ortiz Jr., and really looked like a winner the entire every step of the way. Won off by, I think, 7 or 8 lengths. Got a 93 buyer, was geared down. I think he could have run a little bit faster than that. he's a horse who hasn't been 2 turns yet, so obviously that's a question mark. But I thought of the undercard performances, that was the most interesting one to me, and I'm looking forward to see where he ends up in next.
Well, they said he's probably going to go in the Gotham next, and John Service said after the race, and you don't hear this this time of year from anybody who's got a 3-year-old with any sort of ability. He was saying, I don't know if this horse is a Derby horse. I really don't think he is, as a matter of fact. We're going to stick to 1 turn in the Gotham, then we'll see. So it's one of the rare trainers who does not have Derby fever. He should know better than anybody else. He's already won a Kentucky Derby, so he knows what it takes to get a horse in there. So, they might be thinking that they've got a great miler, but, if they go and win the Gotham by 5-6 lengths, I think they'd almost be, have to take a chance at 2 turns after that.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I mean, John is, as honest as the day is long. So if you ask him a question, he's going to be upfront, whether he's on the camera or off air. He's going to tell you exactly what he thinks. And their thinking is the 1-turn mile is definitely the right thing to do, is the Gotham. And the owner, Chuck Zachney, is very Preakness-centric. He was always treated very well in the Preakness in years past. He's actually been in there a few times. He's won one, obviously, with the Fleet Alex. And he loves racing in that on that day and in that race specifically. So I wouldn't be surprised, even if he wins the Gotham by 4 or 5 or 6 lengths in your example, that they skip the Derby and just focus on the Preakness. It's just my feeling on it, my insight on it.
In terms of this weekend, I think the 2 main headliners, you've got Independence Hall running in the Sam F. Davis, and then you've got Sunday in the 7 furlong San Vicente Storm the Cart, champion 2-year-old returns. It'll be interesting to see how he follows up on basically 1 race. We ran a great race in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but it remains to be seen what his true quality is. And I think in the San Vicente we'll get a little bit better of an idea about it. But those are the 2 main things to look for this weekend in terms of shaking up the Derby picture. This week's news was sponsored by West Point Thoroughbreds. Joining a West Point Thoroughbreds partnership is one of the most affordable, smart, and fun ways for new owners to enjoy all the fun of being an insider in an entirely new world for a fraction of the cost. Check us out at westpointtb.com. All right, so that's going to do it for this week's episode of the TDN Writers Room. I want to thank Bill Finley, John Green, Alan Carasso, our Green Group Guest of the Week, Pat Cummings, our producer, Patty Wolf, and our editor, Nathan Wilkinson. We will see you next week.